Hi and welcome to this disassembly of the Chinese PT5000 automatic movement. This particular movement, as you are probably aware, is a clone, an exact clone that is, of the ETA 28242, and this is due to the patent on this movement, which was made back in the 70s originally, I believe, being expired. So it is perfectly reasonable and acceptable for clones of this movement and various others to be made. The quality of this one is far, far superior to any of the 28242 Chinese-made clone movements I've seen so far, including the Seagull versions. The Seagull ones generally are pretty good. There are some incredibly poor quality ones, and they thankfully are apparent from a quick glance. You can see how much rougher they look, even just looking at the top of the movement on this side that you're seeing right now. As you can see there, we've removed the crown and stem, the oscillating weight, and the automatic winding works module. And here I'm going ahead to remove the balance wheel. I like to get this out of the way as early as possible during a disassembly because it is the most fragile bit. Obviously the incredibly fragile balance pivot and the hairspring, which can be damaged easily. So with it removed and out of the way, you can be sure that you're not going to slip and cause any damage to that hairspring, for example. Here we're removing the case clamps, which are standard type ETA case clamps. You'll note in many watches that use ETA movements, you'll see case clamps like this. And as you can see, these are slightly curved. You can see a little bit of spring in the movement there, where the other case clamp is holding that in place. With these removed, we can turn the watch over and onto the casing cushion, and the movement simply drops out. The next step is to remove the hand stack from the dial, so using a piece of plastic to protect the dial and hand levers, which are my preferred tool of choice for removing hands. They lift off very easily. Here we're removing the movement ring. Again, another nicely made metal component. And then with an appropriate tool, in this case one of my screwdrivers, I'm just unhooking the clamps which hold the dial feet in place. Ordinarily, I would have a preference between alternative methods, but when it comes to dial screws versus these clamps that ETA use, I really don't mind either way because they both work exceptionally well. I wouldn't say one is particularly easier than another, but the distinct benefit is that you cannot really lose these because they're fitted to the movement itself, whereas with a dial screw, if it's left loose, it can come away in the cleaning machine, and because they're so incredibly tiny, you have to be very, very careful not to lose them. So with the dial removed and the dial spacing ring, we've taken off the hour wheel with its dial washer, and mounting that into the movement holder, we're removing the calendar components. This consists of the cover plate with the intermediate wheel, which is fitted in place. This transfers the movement from the hour wheel to the calendar wheel, which rotates and turns the calendar ring, which you will note is absent. Next is the jumper, which sits under the intermediate plate. And it's absent from this watch because it's simply not needed. Sometimes they are left in place, and that is not particularly a problem in and of itself. But in this case, what they have done is just removed the calendar ring, but left all of the other calendar components, which is kind of nice, because should you ever in the future want to take one of these movements and put it into a watch which uses a calendar window, you could always fit a calendar ring. So there we've removed the cover for the keyless works, the dial side train, and removed the minute wheel and cannon pinion, and then the quick calendar setting wheel, and there you just saw the intermediate setting wheel for the dial side train. This is what enables you to set the hands. Next to be removed is the setting lever spring. This also serves as an integrated spring for the yoke as well as the setting lever, which is a nice little design by ETA. And you can see, rather than the typical 2 components under here, we have 3, because one of those components, the one at the very bottom, which is removed after the setting lever here, is the one which moves the intermediate wheel for setting in the first position the calendar quick set, and in the second position the hands. And you can see there how that rocks to achieve that. Last to come out are the winding pinion and the sliding pinion or clutch. And there is a little close-up of the back and the front of the movement, or rather the bottom and the top of the movement, I should say. Moving on to the top of the movement, the next thing to be removed is the winding components. Note that the wind in the mainspring has been released at this point, otherwise that would just spin down rapidly once the pallets are removed, and also once the winding wheels were removed. So the crown wheel is held by a large screw with a large washer head, which is an anti-clockwise thread, and then the ratchet wheel with a smaller standard thread screw. Next for removal is the pallet fork bridge. This is held in place by 2 screws. And then the pallet fork. After this, we move on to the train bridge, which is held in place by 2 screws. And with this removed, it allows us to access and remove the 3rd, 4th and escape wheels. It does contain the dual upper for the 2nd wheel, but this wheel cannot be removed until the barrel bridge is removed, as it sits underneath the mainspring barrel. The mainspring barrel is removed similarly to the train bridge and is held in place by 3 screws. Care must be taken when lifting this bridge, to ensure that you do not disturb or lose the balance stop lever, or the hack as many people refer to it. And you'll see this once the bridge is removed. There's the little L-shaped lever that you can see just there. This is moved by the sliding pinion or clutch and contacts the rim of the balance wheel with enough force to stop it spinning, and this is what provides the hacking function. And there you can see the second wheel and obviously the mainspring barrel that we've just removed. Here's a close-up of the main plate with all of the components removed. And I'm also going to remove the main spring here so that we can inspect the innards of the barrel and check what's going on there. And this is something that I'm glad I did, because on the first wind I thought it felt a little bit tight and gritty once it had reached the full wind capacity. And this, it transpires, was due to a distinct lack of braking grease on the barrel walls. And while it's not an enormous problem in the short term, in the long term, what would have happened is the bridle sliding around the barrel walls would have scored those barrel walls and caused a problem with it being used in the future. Here I'm just getting the mainspring barrel up close so you can see how little braking grease there is in there. Those little indents are where on the ETA directions you put blobs of braking grease, which then gets spread evenly around the barrel walls. But there was so little in there you could barely tell it was there at all. Moving on to the reassembly, I'm actually going off the conventional assembly method here, because in my foolish haste to try and get this disassembled, cleaned, reassembled and recased in one evening so that I could get this all filmed and edited ready for upload, I decided I would fit the keyless works first, so that once the movement side was completed I would be able to wind and check that all was moving as it should. In hindsight, I don't recommend this. It's doable, it's perfectly doable, but it does make it a little bit more fiddly to fit the winding pinion and the sliding pinion once assembling the movement side and the barrel bridge. So it's far easier to put the movement side and barrel bridge in first and then do this afterwards, but it is doable as said. All of the sliding metal to metal contact points on the keyless works are lubricated, in this case with Mobius 8300 grease. And checking that all of, or rather both of the springs for the yoke and the setting lever are in place. I'm just tightening that down and applying a little more grease to both of those points. We then turn to the movement side and fit the second wheel. The mainspring barrel has been rebuilt with an appropriate amount of braking grease on the barrel walls and the spring cleaned and refitted, and then applying a little D5 onto the pivot. This is put in place. Next, I'm applying a little lubrication to the balance stop lever post. And next is the winding pinion and sliding pinion, which needs to be currently held in place by the crown and stem. And as mentioned, it's actually easier and better to do this after fitting the barrel bridge and fitting it through the front. But again, as said, it is achievable to do it this way. Just a little more fiddly and really not worth the extra time that it took. And with hindsight, I would not try to shortcut that again. So the upper pivot of the mainspring barrel is lubricated likewise with D5, and the barrel bridge is fitted and screwed into place, and the operation of the stem to the keyless works and the balance stop lever is checked before tightening those down. And there I'm just checking again the operation of the stem. Here you'll see me rushing ahead again a little too much, again in my haste to try and make things quicker. So here I'm placing the ratchet wheel for the mainspring barrel, and forgetting of course that the fourth wheel needs to sit underneath this. So you will note that later when I fit the train of wheels and fit the fourth wheel that I have to remove and replace that. Not a major thing, but again, just be aware that it's not advisable to fit that until the train of wheels are in place. The crown wheel, however, is not a problem. That can be fitted. So there I'm just fitting the click and the click spring in place, and then with a little bit of lubrication on the elliptical faces where the crown wheel sits, and a little bit of grease where the click contacts the spring, we can fit the crown wheel and tighten that into place. This does take a little bit of wiggling because it has to be fitted in such a way that it holds the click under tension. So you do have to be careful that you don't ping this off into the ether as you're trying to fit it. And there I'm applying a little bit of D5 onto the upper faces to ensure that there's no friction or dragging from the screw that holds the crown wheel in place. And as mentioned, this is a left hand thread, so righty loosey, lefty tighty. Checking that everything's free there, we then move on to the train of wheels with the third wheel, the escape wheel, and with a little bit of 90-10 on the shoulder of the fourth wheel, where it contacts the tube, we slot that into place, discovering, as mentioned, that the ratchet wheel needs to be moved. And feeling slightly foolish, I go ahead and do that, as you can see. Make sure everything's in place, and then we just pop it back on. As said, not a major thing, but I did feel a little bit silly, and this is definitely a do as I say, not as I do. Next to be fitted is the train bridge, ensuring that all of the pivots are nicely aligned. This quite literally just dropped straight into place, every bit as nicely and smoothly as a genuine ETA movement would do. And again, it's a distinctly good sign that it's a very well built, well made movement. The lubrication, incidentally, on this was overall quite good, and this would have been an automated lubrication process. It was overall quite good. All the pivots were well oiled, and there was a little bit of dirt and detritus around and about the movement, as you will see if you watch the review. But that said, that I'm not hugely surprised at, looking at the price point, and that could very well have occurred during casing up of the watch rather than where the movement was assembled itself. Here I'm fitting the pallets and pallet bridge, and upon tightening the pallet bridge down, I then go ahead to check the end shake on the pallets. Incidentally, during reassembly and disassembly and reassembly, I did check the end and side shake of all of the pallets. Here I'm checking the end shake of the pallets and the actual operation of them. And finding about 5mm of movement. And for our colonial cousins, that translates to about 1.25 inches or something like that, which is, of course, way too much. And that had to be corrected. So releasing the power there, I went ahead, removed the pallet bridge, and using my jeweling tool, adjusted the jewel in the pallet bridge down a little to make that a much more respectable half an inch or so. Obviously, I'm slightly exaggerating the measurements there, but you get the general meaning. Here we're lubricating the train of wheels, having just done the dial side, moving onto the upper movement side. And that's the second, third, fourth and escape wheel pivots. Obviously the pivots of the pallet fork are not lubricated, but the faces of the pallet stones are lubricated with 9415, which is a thixotropic grease. Fascinating word, I love that word. And here we're fitting the balance in and seeing a heartbeat, which is always nice to see on a rebuild. Give that a little tighten, and at this point I can give the movement a full wind. I always put about one wind on a movement before fitting the balance, because that's a really good indicator to me of how well a movement is looking, and how well the balance oscillates with very little wind on it. So what I was pointing out at the back of the cannon pinion there was the greasing points where the two bars cross across the cannon pinion. A small amount of grease is applied there, and that provides the sliding friction. And it's not a snap-in cannon pinion, it just simply sits on board there. The minute wheel post is lubricated, the post for the intermediate setting wheel is lubricated, the pin on the quick change star is also greased, and then the cover plate, which holds all that in place, can be fitted and screwed into place. Here I'm just checking the operation, although obviously the calendar component side of things isn't needed. I just like to know that everything is connected and working as it should. And here we're fitting the calendar change components, the jumper spring, a little bit of lubrication on the calendar drive wheel, and post. And then the post which the intermediate wheel sits on, which is connected to the cover plate. If this had a calendar wheel, that would have been fitted prior to fitting the advance wheel and the jumper spring, etc. And then this plate would clamp it all down. So a little bit of lubrication on the cannon pinion. The hour wheel is fitted. Make sure that that's meshing correctly. And there I'm just checking that everything is meshed correctly and that it is driving the calendar wheel as it should. Again, not relevant for the fact it doesn't have a calendar wheel, but essential to make sure that it's behaving as it should. The dial washer is then applied to the hour wheel, and the dial ring and the dial itself is fitted using a sheet of tissue paper and just holding the dial in place. This is in addition to finger cuts to minimize the risk of putting marks on the dial, and then the locking pins are pushed into place. At this point I can go ahead and refit the hands. That's not shown because you've seen that in numerous of my other videos, but the hands are fitted and aligned and checked. The movement is then refitted into the case along with the casing ring and the clamps, like so. And once that is all secured, the operation is checked with regards to winding and time setting and making sure that it's behaving itself and none of the hands are contacting each other and so on. And at this point, the watch is placed on the time grapher and rough regulated before being left for 24 hours to run in for final regulation. After that, the automatic works, which was stripped, cleaned and reassembled, are refitted along with the oscillating weight. The seal for the case back is re-greased and refitted, and then it's pressure tested. So that concludes the disassembly, reassembly, lubrication and inspection of the Chinese PT5000 ETA28242 clone. I hope you found this useful and informative and interesting, and please join us in the next video. Thank you for watching.